You're listening to Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with an emphasis on homeopathy.
Hi, I'm Jody, the mom.
And I'm Dr. Barr, the doc, and this is Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with a special emphasis on homeopathy. Today, we're not going to talk specifically or exclusively about homeopathy. We are going to address the interaction of food and diet and nutrition with impacts on pans, and we will bring in homeopathy for some of the ways that homeopathy can help with those things. But food is really just such a big component with pans, so we thought that it was the best place to jump off after we wrapped up our conversation about the healing journey and the trajectory that Jody and her family went on, as we're diving into some of these more deeper dives into specific topics. And so the reason we wanted to start with food and diet and nutrition is because it's one of the big symptoms for PANS, right? Is that ARFID, that avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And food gets to be such a really hard thing to deal with in a PANDAS family. And for lots of people, especially if you're going anything outside of the conventional medical route, almost anything that's like natural, integrative, functional, whatever, involves some fairly strict diets. And so we want to talk a little bit about the impact of food on a PANS family, some of the diets that are frequently recommended, and then my take as somebody who's an expert in specialty, who specializes in homeopathy, on my take overall on the impacts of strict diets on kids with PANS and the ways that homeopathy can actually be beneficial as well. So Jody, where would you like to start on this particular topic?
I think with Avery, so we didn't have a whole lot of the food restriction stuff. We did have a little bit. I think her main thing was she thought apples were going to kill her if she ate them all of a sudden. And that was kind of a like just sudden onset thing. So we didn't have a whole lot of that. But I will say that before we got to homeopathy, as I was going through, what are all of the things I can do? Some of the dietary changes were some of the things that I chose to do. So I at the time I took away, I think gluten, and she was already dairy free, and some other stuff. So by the time we got to homeopathy, Avery already had some diet stuff was a stress for her, right? Because I had pulled all the gluten away from her, and that was very stressful for a young kid. And then, there was some other changes that I was doing too, where she just knew that she couldn't have foods that she used to have. And so there was already a little bit of stress because of the food stuff. And then she had the couple of foods where she was like, no, I don't want to eat it. Yeah. This is one of the things that I loved about homeopathy was it wasn't, I was afraid that I was going to come in and you were going to be like, oh, we need to do this, and that to her diet. When I had just got done stressing her out, making changes. And I didn't want to add more to that, or I was afraid changes would make her fearful of more foods.
Yeah. So a lot of kids do have that type of OCD essentially around food. The ARFID, the way I see ARFID, is not usually related to like body image, although occasionally it can be. So it's more about fears that something is going to happen with eating, fears that food is going to be poisonous, or this is going to harm them somehow, or they're going to choke. And so a lot of times it's more about those obsessive and intrusive thoughts, and then the restriction is a compulsion to help control or mitigate those thoughts that they have. And so there are some challenges that can come up. So diet is not important. I want to make sure that we're really clear there. Diet is important, and there are some challenges with it, right? So one of the things that diet is really important for is making sure that your body has the nutrients that you need to be able to do the things to help with the recovery and repair. And so if your kiddo has got a very, very restricted, very limited diet, and especially if it's not a very nutrient dense diet, there can be challenges there. And so that's really where you'll see a lot of testing come in for functional nutrient testing and to find out if there's deficiencies, or a lot of supplementation to try and make up for lacks in diet. And then the strictness of a diet can also be related to inflammation, right? And so there are foods that can be anti-inflammatory and there are foods that can be pro-inflammatory. And it can also vary from person to person. So we're dealing with foods that are generally inflammatory for everybody. So think the highly processed foods, the fast foods, the things that come in packages that are made in a factory that you could never make at home and have it be similar because it's got dyes and chemicals and all sorts of things in it that go into making it what it looks like, right? So those are generally inflammatory for everybody.
Yeah.
Even foods that are natural, like sugar in too high amounts, and especially the more processed sugars and more refined sugars, are going to be more inflammatory in general. Then there are some foods that are like the big offenders for food sensitivities that tend to be more inflammatory than others, but they're not inflammatory for everybody. Those are things like gluten, dairy, eggs, soy. Citrus is actually a fairly big one that can be, and then nightshades are another big one. So think about like peppers, tomatoes, that kind of thing. Eggplants. So those are some bigger ones that can have a higher likelihood of being inflammatory for people than other foods. But it's always on an individual level, right? And so there's some foods that are inflammatory for others and some that are not. So some people are really sensitive to like strawberries or broccoli or whatever it happens to be that they are, almonds, so and then I'm talking about not an anaphylactic type of sensitivity. I'm not talking about IgE allergy. I'm talking about just what's called an IgG, lower grade but more insidious type of inflammatory response. And so a lot of people will look for which foods are the people are most reactive to and then remove those foods. And there is some benefit in that. And so the benefit there is that we are reducing the overall inflammatory load because we know that PANDAS is associated with inflammation of the brain. And so when we have inflammation broadly in our body, of course, it's going to impact our brain. There's also a lot of talk about leaky gut or hyperpermeability of the intestinal lining. And there is some evidence that if you have leaky gut, that there's leaky brain too, which is where we have some of that crossover. We always think about our brain as this like super special place that we've got the blood-brain barrier and nothing can get through it. But the reality is it can become more permeable. And so removing some of these food sensitivities can help with reducing the overall inflammatory load. And we do see a lot of improvements for kiddos in following these diets. So I want to make sure I'm up front right there. Like, I'm not opposed to getting started with some of these diets if they are working for your family or if you're in crisis. I think that one of the challenges, and Jody, you sort of mentioned this already, so I'd love to talk a little bit about this, is that when we're doing really strict diets for kids who are already feeling feeling different, feeling like having challenges with going to school, challenges with relating to people, when we add on that extra layer, or if we've got kids who already have a lot of fears and obsessive and intrusive thoughts about food or their health, if we add on, these foods aren't good for you and they aren't something you should eat, it can actually compound some of their obsessive and compulsive behaviors, right? Obsessive thinking and compulsive behaviors. So talk to me a little bit more about your experience with identifying and food allergies or food sensitivities, removing them, and the impacts on overall well-being.
So I think Avery had a endoscopy and they did some allergy testing when they did that. And they found, a couple of things that I didn't know she was allergic to soy. I didn't know that she like bananas and pineapple and a couple of other things I had no idea that she was allergic to. So we immediately removed those things. And I think, as I was talking about earlier, we, remove things over time. I believe that I saw some improvement in Avery. She was, when she would have food reactions, they were typically behavioral. She would and especially blue food dye was the worst for her. She would just go bananas and like into this like super behavioral, just whacked out kid that it just didn't look like Avery. So removing all of those things did help. I feel like, the diet work that we did before we got to homeopathy, it set her up for success with homeopathy, and then removing some of those things were beneficial. But I feel like with us specifically, even without the ARFID, there was just so much stress around the table because that was a time whenever I was trying to get Avery to take all of the supplements that she was on at that time. So that was stressful. It even like her memory issues, eating and then completely forgetting that she ate, and then us going back into like trying to figure out there was just so much stress that happened around food in my house. And so it was I think I'm not answering your question here. It was beneficial to do all of the dietary things that we did, and I'm glad that we did them.
And it was a stressor as well.
Yeah.
So you touched on something that I think is important to bring up, which is that following as good a diet as possible can set you up for some success with homeopathy, because it reduces that inflammatory load and it gives your body the usually a better, broader array of nutrients that it's able to use as building blocks for the work that homeopathy needs to do, and it's nudging the body to heal and helping it to heal on its own, because you know it can't work with something if the building blocks aren't there, right? So one of the challenges though is that with limited diets and restricted diets, if you have like as some people call like a dietary infraction, I'm using like air quotes, of like if you are completely eliminating gluten and dairy, but you have like even a little bit of gluten, or a lot of times you'll start to see the symptoms that it's palliating by not having it, they'll come back. And that's because, like many things that we're dealing with, we haven't addressed the susceptibility. We can help our bodies become less reactive to these things, because the reality is, if it was all just bad across the board, then everybody would have reactions to these things, right? And so when we can see that these are inflammatory for some people and not for others, that's where we get into that place of susceptibility that we talked about in a previous episode. And so this is where homeopathy can really, again, come in and be beneficial. That, I mean, should people necessarily be having gluten and dairy all day, every day? Probably not, for many reasons, including the fact that, like, one, they do tend to be more inflammatory to a lot more people. And two, most things that have a lot of gluten and dairy in them are hyper processed and just don't have a lot of great nutrient value in them. So it's not so much that the gluten and the dairy is the biggest problem, it's what the gluten and the dairy allows in a diet that can be more of a challenge.
Yeah.
So what homeopathy can do is help address those susceptibilities and the specific reactions that people have to them, so that you can have a diet that allows that sometimes, you know, so that the kiddo maybe doesn't have, you know, birthday cake every day, but when they go to a birthday party, they can have birthday cake and not have to worry about what's going to happen, or they can have a slice of pizza at that same party and not have to worry about paying the price after the fact for the quote unquote dietary infraction. And the reality too, right, Jody, I mean, like, you're getting into the place that you're dealing with this with your kiddos and their age now. You only have so long that you have control, and that this is a place that people will rebel against pretty quickly. Adults too. I mean, how many of us, like, there's a reason that the diet industry makes so much money, is because we all just want to eat the things that are easy, convenient, taste good, whatever. And it's to expect somebody who's still getting like neurological development and recognizing their own autonomy to follow really, really strict dietary rules, and it's just not realistic for a lot of people.
Yeah. I think I might be switching topics here a little bit, sort of, but I want to say it. In the beginning, I think I remember you telling me that homeopathy could help allergies, right when we first started with Avery. There was nothing in the world that could make me believe that the food, or even like the whole apple thing, I was like, no, like, she's probably never going to eat apples again. And then eventually she started eating apples. That's been the coolest thing to watch heal. Like the first couple of times she was, like you said, at birthday parties, I'm like, all right, we'll do a cupcake and see what happens. And then she has no reaction to it. And then it's okay, the next birthday party, we'll have a pizza and a cupcake. And those things aren't all the time, but getting to enjoy those things on occasion is a really special thing to her, special thing to me too. But it's really nice watching the, we still keep the diet as clean as we possibly can because we want our bodies to feel good and be as healthy as possible. But it's nice to be able to have those kind of one-off things.
So I want to touch on one thing related to food sensitivity, since that's sort of where we started before we then shift gears to like just the kids who themselves are like very restrictive and very limited in what they eat, whether it's sensory issues or something else that's contributing to it. So I want to give people a little bit of information on how to identify food sensitivities, because this might be something that would be new to listeners. And so food sensitivities can be identified in a couple of different ways. The gold standard to identify food sensitivities is to do a short-term, very like allergen elimination diet, where we're basically having very, very, very narrow foods that we eat for about 10 to 14 days that are not foods that you typically eat and that are low allergenic foods in general. So this could be something like eating nothing but bison, pears, sweet potatoes, and brown rice for 10 to 14 days. So then we reduce all of the inflammatory load. We get our body a chance to settle and to stop responding and reacting to any of the foods that we're sensitive to. And then you add in one by one over the course of 3 to 7 days, one food at a time. And so, you would do like cream of wheat made with water, not milk, so that you can just test the wheat, right? And so it has to be very, very precise. So you're testing just the one thing. And then you basically add it for 3 to 7 days. See if you have any reaction to it. If you have no reaction, then you add it to your safe list, and then you move on to the next food, and you see how things are going. And if you do have a reaction to it and you notice like any adverse effects in your health and any of your symptoms flaring up or just generally feeling unwell, then you put it on the not safe food or the try later food. And then you stop and go back to wherever you were at before. So like if you're at that baseline, the very first food you react to, you go back to just those very minimal foods. But basically you just go back to like where you were before you added that food. So if it's like the 7th food, you go with the 6 foods plus the baseline. And then you eat that, only those foods for another 3 to 7 days, or however long it takes for all of the symptoms that have come about as a result of eating that food to go away. And then you try the next food. So that's the gold standard. Obviously, holy cow, that could take forever to go through, right? And then it just means that you have a really, really strict, really, really limited diet, and it's restricted of activities in the world too, right? Because then if you want to go to dinner at somebody's house or go out to eat someplace with other people, you have to take the foods with you, and you can only eat those things. And so, and that can be just challenging for lots of reasons, because then it can lead to difficult conversations too. So that's again, like the gold standard. There are food allergy tests that can be done. None of them are 100% accurate. And that's the biggest challenge. They can give you some insight or a place to start. But if you're still having symptoms, you might need to start doing a different exploration if you are wanting to use foods and food specific diets and food allergy, food sensitivity removal as part of your treatment strategy. And so there's a lot of different tests that can be done. Again, like I said, they're not 100% accurate. And some of these tests, none of them are covered by insurance, that are like the broad spectrum food allergy tests. They use different ways that they're going to assess for it. Ultimately, they're generally looking for IgG or IgA or IgE. So these are different immune globulins that form as a result of exposure to something that is seen as an allergy. IgE is a more fast acting, like what we typically think of with food allergies, like the nut and shellfish allergies. IgG tends to be more slow and insidious, and is actually really associated with some of these more inflammatory, like long-standing inflammation symptoms. So they don't have that immediate response, which is why you have to give 3 to 7 days. But they can really add up over time and like increase that general inflammatory load. So some of the challenges with them, though, is that people will have done, colleagues of mine have done tests on some of these tests where they will send the same blood sample from the same person, divide it into 2 different samples, give them different names, like a John Doe name essentially, and come back and they have different foods that they're sensitive to. Some are better than others that have more consistency from with the same person drawn on the same day. And so you can talk to whoever your natural health provider, integrative provider, functional medicine provider, naturopathic doctor, whatever, and you can talk to them about which ones they find to be the most reliable in their experience. The other thing to think about with this, though, too, is that it's more likely to show up the things that you eat regularly. And that's partially a result of the fact that what leads to food sensitivities is having that hyperpermeability of the intestine or leaky gut that we talk about, where things that should be digested and absorbed inside the alimentary tract are getting through. They're getting through these barriers that should be really, really tight, and instead they're loose, and so things are getting through. And so it's going to more likely show things that you eat on a regular basis. So if you test today and then you cut out all the things that you see today, and then you replace all of the dairy and the gluten with corn and which I forgot to mention is another one of the common allergens. But you replace all the gluten in the dairy with corn and soy, then suddenly you're going to see on the next test that you do a lot more corn and soy show up. So those are some of the challenges that with food allergy testing. But as I said, even with those limitations and challenges, they can be helpful to help get you out of that and like brain on fire space. Yeah. All right.
I'm channeling some PANDAS moms right now and feeling like, since this is kind of outward facing, and I know that we have family members, we have grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and friends that are listening to this. It's the best possible thing that anybody could do for a PANDAS mom is to just support her, and a PANDAS dad too, is just to support. And sometimes supporting looks like going along with something that you don't understand. And this is one of those things where it's really hard to understand. It's easy for people to understand my kid's anaphylactic to this.
Yeah.
It's also easy to understand, here's this blood work, my kid's allergic to this. What's harder to understand is my kid is sensitive to this. I never had a test that said Avery is allergic to blue food dye. All I knew is that she went absolutely crazy. So if you have a mom or a dad asking you to withhold from giving a child certain foods, support is really, really an amazing thing, because oftentimes you're not going to see the reaction. They're going to have a delayed reaction or something like that. So that one of the sweetest, kindest things that you could do to your family member that is trying to navigate this is to take them at their word and support them through that by doing what they ask you to and not to do as far as food wise. And that includes sugar too, because a lot of our kids just go absolutely bananas on sugar in a way that some people have never seen a kid go bananas on sugar. So that support piece of it is, I know, really, really appreciated. And it's such a beneficial part of what we're trying to do with our kiddo and getting them healed and through this journey.
And that's a really good segue to the last little bit that I want to talk about before we wrap for today, which is that a lot of kids are just going to refuse certain foods, like they have restrictive eating because of sensory issues, or they've got the restrictive food intake disorder because of fears that they have or whatever it happens to be. And so with kids with PANDAS, they have hypersensitivity to the world around them, right? And they're like more sensitive to all sensory input, including like what foods taste like, what they feel like in the mouth. Like some kids will even be so specific that they'll eat this one brand of processed chicken nugget, and that is it. And give yourself some grace. If your kiddo will only eat beige foods and only eat certain things, like you have to feed your child. And so we understand that that's where we're at. And so that can be one thing that can keep people from seeking help outside of the conventional system, is like, I just can't I know I'm going to have to go on these really strict diets and I'm not going to be able to do it. And so with homeopathy, at least in the way that I practice homeopathy, we understand that we have to meet people in the world that we live in the real world. We can't force people into the ideal world and say, well, you can only work with me if you follow this strict diet, and if you don't take any of these medications or supplements. Like, we have to work with the person where they are to help them get to a place that is more ideal, right? And so we don't require any strict diets. They can be helpful, but they're not necessary for healing to occur. And the good news about homeopathy is it tends to, eventually you will need to have some dietary changes to get to the full extent of healing. Like you can't have, no human period can be as healthy as they possibly could be if they are only living on frozen chicken nuggets and French fries. It's just nobody can be like thrive at their healthiest in that with that diet. The good news with homeopathy is that as we heal and as we're nudging our body is getting to that place of healing, acceptance and desire for healthy foods and a broader range of foods comes with it, because a healthy person in a healthy state and a healthy body seeks healthier foods and seeks more variety in healthy foods. And so I can't tell you how many people we've talked to that have come in with like 5 foods that their kid will accept, and their big hoorays are when they are able to try foods on their own that they never would have tried before, and just expanding their palate, expanding acceptance, having less sensory reactivity to things, as well as also reducing their physical reactivity and their immune response to things as the gut is healing, as the susceptibility to having this particular reaction to these particular foods is healing as well. So that's really the part that homeopathy comes in, is that it addresses that susceptibility to whatever you have going on as it relates to food, whether it's sensitivity to certain foods, even full-on allergies to certain foods, though that's a little bit different and not really what we're talking about here. It can help with that sensory issues with food. It can help with the obsessive compulsive block to certain foods. It can help with general food acceptance and willingness to try new and different things as well. And then just seeking out more healthy and better foods on their own as well. So I know that's been a lot of your experience, Jody. Anything you want to wrap with for families that are listening?
It's just a really neat process it's hard. The food stuff is hard. And because we don't have experience with the ARFID stuff, I have experience with my younger daughter being on a very restricted diet for something other than PANDAS and ARFID. And man, that's a really hard thing to do. And it's really neat to come through some healing and watch that start to improve. Yeah. And then I love the moms celebrating in the group with the hallelujahs about their kids eating more foods and being willing to try things. And so it's neat. And I've seen that over and over again throughout the years where these kiddos are overcoming whatever, whether it be fear or whether it be actual allergies. Overcoming that and being able to have more freedom in their diet. So just another one of the 478 million amazing things about homeopathy is that it can just correct that craziness that's happening in the immune system. Yeah. Very neat.
So we're going to wrap today and just give you the reminder, as Jody shared, she just mentioned the group and seeing moms come in and talk about that. Just remind you that we host a private Facebook group called Homeopathy for Pans and Pandas. You're welcome to join us, where we give lots of education and support and community, where the parents who are going through this and learning about homeopathy or healing with homeopathy can help people along through the process and just be there for the good times, the bads, the ups, the downs, all of the things. So you're welcome to join us. There is a link to it in the show notes, and we will hopefully have you back with us for our next episode, where we are talking about PANDAS and mold, which is a really common thing that comes up. So we want to make sure we tackle it early on. So we hope you'll join us there.
Bye, guys.
We hope you found this episode helpful, hopeful, and inspiring. We try to get a new episode out every week. You can make sure you don't miss any by following us on Spotify or subscribing to our channel on YouTube. If you want to connect with us more, join our Facebook group, Homeopathy for Pans and Pandas, where we have exclusive weekly videos and answer your questions about, you guessed it, homeopathy for pans and pandas throughout the week. If you are already a member, give us a shout out and let us know what you thought about this episode. If you aren't on Facebook and would like to reach us, you can email us at podcast@resiliencenaturopathic.com. Until next time, take care and remember, this won't be forever.